Welcome to day 2 of our conference on decoloniality, sovereignty, and territoriality, and of course the end of cognitive empire. Today we have a full slate of presentations, including student discussion groups this afternoon, and we really want to encourage that you be here for that. This is going to be an opportunity for students at all levels to talk without the intimidation of professors. That will be this afternoon. You're welcome to join, but please don't dominate the conversation or let the students talk. We will have some student facilitators locally from the University of Denver who will be helping with those sessions, depending on the amount of attendance we have. But we please urge you to be involved in that. One of the problems with conferences is that we assume this, we come to give our papers and then we leave. And of course, the whole notion of decoloniality is about something else. It's about developing relationships or reciprocal kinds of exchanges. And it's also about leveling the hierarchy of power. Decoloniality means challenging the colonial matrix of power and student-professor hierarchies and the sort of institutional structure of knowledge, where knowledge is produced almost in a feudal fashion, is one of the things we really want to call into question here. And we call it into question, I think, most effectively by actually practicing it rather than just talking about it. So, all right, with that being all said, I just want to give the usual disclaimers we've had here, that your participation in this conference today we take as automatic consent to be recorded and to have this posted publicly. Again, if you don't say anything, you will not be recorded. But if you do say something, you will be recorded and it will be put up online later on. So, that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Jared Lacey, who is a graduate student at the University of Denver and is also an assistant editor of the New Polis and works with Whitestone Publications, and he will facilitate, we're using that term rather than moderate, the sessions. So, Jared?
All right. Thanks for everybody for being here. It's really cool. One of the benefits we've mentioned a number of times throughout the conference so far is that one of the benefits of being online in the Zoom format is that we get to have scholars from around the world. And today we're fortunate to have 2 scholars from New Delhi, India. Magna Mohapatra is a first-year PhD candidate at the Sociology Department of South Asian University in New Delhi. She is currently working on a theorization of political humor in South Asia. Meanwhile, Zunayed Ehsan is also a first-year PhD scholar in the Department of Sociology at South Asian University, and he is working on, pardon me if I mispronounce any of this, Maulana Bhashani's idea of Rububiyya, or the philosophy of nourishment, a political theology to deal with alterity. They have both co-authored other works as well, including a paper called Genocide and Statelessness from Nazi Regime to Contemporary Times, Disease or Symptom. And today, they will be discussing Reconstructing Diversal Ontologies, Unlearning as a Methodology of Decolonial Living. So with that said, I will turn it over to Magna.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jared. So hello, everyone, and I'm Magna. And before we start, we would like to thank Carl and Roger for organizing this conference, which is very much the need of the hour, and for giving us the opportunity to be a part of it. It has been quite a learning experience yesterday. So this paper is born out of our academic interest in looking at our experiences and local knowledge systems with the aim of going about alternate forms of theory. So here we are not delving into a detailed analysis of the various ontologies, but we intend to present their conceptual framework so as to give an idea of the praxis of decoloniality that can emerge from these ontologies. And it may seem a bit disconnected as we have incorporated diverse philosophies, but in its essence, it embodies the idea of decoloniality, and that is the broad goal of this paper. Also, we are writing from the vantage point of South Asia, but we have incorporated ways of knowing from other parts of the world as well, so as to present what we think can be seen as diversal. We acknowledge there are many indigenous knowledge systems, and this paper obviously cannot and does not cover all of it, but we have taken the ones which we think has had a lasting impact till today on the local communities and within the global academic knowledge spaces in general. So this paper has three broad sections. The first focuses on what to unlearn, that is the hegemony of colonial knowledge. The second part talks about the diverse ontologies that can be seen as a form of unlearning. And the third part is an attempt at self-critique of the notion of decoloniality itself. So I will begin and my colleague will take over in the third section. So what is it that we need to unlearn? The genealogy of our current colonized living trace back to ideological constructions of what was essentially pre-modern Europe. What came to be semantically framed as modern Europe had its roots in the ideological construct of Greece, Rome, Europe, which was a unilinear diachrony of the Eurocentric Aryan model and nothing to do with the originary Greece. And this we know from Enric Dussel's work on transmodernity. So this internalization of this colonial domination within the global South intensified with the propagation of the discourse of modernity, with Europe as the center of the world system. Further, the ideals of scientific rationality, modernization, civilization, and progress that the colonizers sort of dangled on the, quote unquote, savage inhabitants were internalized by the natives as the only unilinear model of evolution. So the imposition of such knowledge systems, which originated from the modern day Europe, catered to the expansion of the economy of the West and exploited its forced beneficiaries, leading to their inferiorization. The centuries of colonial oppression led to the internalization in their psyche that they were indeed the other, the savage, the barbaric, and the slave. The ones who could break free, or at least appeared to break free from the stereotype, were the ones who were the English educated, quote unquote, babus, as was referred in India, who learned and acculturated themselves in the ways and means of the English by dressing up and educating themselves in the Western education. And thus came to be, quote unquote, accepted by their colonial masters. Hence, English education, along with the ideological indoctrinations of modernity and violence as a means of suppression, led to the reproduction of Western knowledge in the non-West. And this practice of what we know as Western knowledge continued and still continues to produce knowledge in its that in its foundational epistemology is Eurocentric. Hence, even if there exist other modes of explaining the world around us, the non-traditional theories have remained in the margin and in many cases, extinct as well. So the native or local forms of knowledge that are still accessible today and are to a large extent not as extensive or detailed as the Eurocentric theories, but they are also neglected within the local communities. In other cases, even if there exists a robust native or non-West theory, as we call it, the attempt to bring it to the mainstream global arena has not been widespread, or these works are not considered essential. So further, there's also the presence of our own uneasiness, or we can say the unwillingness to accept and bring into discourse the traditional thinkers and their ideas. While it is expected that we cite established, mostly European thinkers for the theories to be considered legitimate, the mainstream intellectuals who go on to be associated with the Western academic spaces do not take up the task of looking inward. So these intellectuals who are from those indigenous or global south places, post-colonial places, so they also do not take up this task of looking inward, as they also have, and we, by they I mean we also have this Eurocentric conditioning, which has been ingrained in us. Uh, so we considered any non-Western theories as trivial or not academic enough. So moreover, if theories of Eurocentric spaces do not fit the South Asian context, then they are termed as deviant histories of lack. Like we do not realize that these Western theories were never supposed to fit in the local context, because our conditions and contexts are not the same. However, we see as a way of knowing and being depends on how we are trained to see. So reflections, myths, oral literature, even fiction can be seen as source of knowledge if one can be flexible enough to look for it beyond the Eurocentric intellectual spaces. Considerably within the academic spaces, our intellectual leanings have evolved from the same colonial forms of education and discourses that continue to plague the entire world. So it does not, however, mean that these Western theories are not applicable beyond the West. They do explain some aspect of our lived realities, but it is also necessary to realize that they do not and cannot explain everything. So the tone of assumed universal applicability that has been used by the Western theories in the form of cognitive colonization can also be seen in the form of quote unquote othering, wherein their theories have been superimposed on our cultural historical realities to the extent that theorizing from our own embodied knowledge is not legitimate enough. For example, theories on any class, labor, or inequality issues in South Asia derive their experiential understanding within the Marxist frameworks, but do not attempt to study Fule or Bhashani. So these are South Asian theorists, or not theorists, activists, who have strived to politically empower the oppressed and the exploited within South Asia, which I will talk about them further later. So the way we know what we know has been through a very singular hegemonic vantage point. And in this context, decolonial discourses emerging both from within and outside of this Euro-American zones have shed light on the anxieties of knowing beyond the hegemonic traditions. So the colonized subject has always been seen as the other with the inherent need for legitimacy by the West. This involves the colonially induced discourses that has an imperial genealogy, but has been uncritically accepted in the everyday lives of the native population of the global South as well as that of the West. So this one has to consciously unlearn them to be able to authentically determine our political rights and tackle the contemporary challenges from the methodological vantage point of our own location, language, history, experience, and local systems. So to be able to decolonize our thinking and engage with this our context and our reality, one needs to be able to look into our present without the lens of the quote unquote white. So to do so is a form of conscious unlearning of the years of colonized education and ideological indoctrinations, for it includes a criticism of our present life forms. To be able to critically think is also to be aware of the intricate neocolonial, neoliberal influences which we face in our everyday lives. There's this critical thinking and unlearning that one needs to do to go beyond mechanical theorizations can be seen as a form of resistance towards existing systems of cognitive domination. In a way, it also challenges us to go beyond this universal one-dimensional man that we are becoming, that is perpetuating a unilinear form of embodied thought and action. So how do we go about these forms of unlearning? So the need for understanding the essence of our geopolitical identity involves conscious reflections with constant questioning, doubting, rethinking. So in order to recognize our lived sensibilities and to make sense of how imperialism affects us till today, both through body and mind, self-reflexivity, along with an awareness of our own biases and our own hypocrisies, is essential. So this paper dwells on these processes of unlearning, which is based on embodied knowledge and personal knowledge systems of the historically oppressed. And this form of decolonial living can be termed as a process of requickening, which Tayake Alfred says that means bringing back to life our own authentic cultures. So this we can do through conscious awareness of this, of diversities or pluriversalities. So it may seem like fighting an aircraft carrier with a kite sort of idea, but it may not, and it may not have the grandeur that is associated with a large aircraft, but it has the possibilities of imagining the world and living in it differently. So the counter collective action against this coloniality of our being can be through conscious engagement with our indigenous and local knowledge systems, but to relocate knowledge within the domain of the people and not institutionalized spaces that has been already. So we need to go beyond academic engagement and engage with it in the economic sphere as well. So as per Garaudi, it's not possible to dream about a new economic system without a new cultural system. So therefore, the primary concern of relocating knowledge is to create the philosophical base of a planetary planning for a human project by unlearning and relearning. So how to unlearn? So one of the primary means to decolonize and disengage from hegemonic modes of thinking is through language. As Ngugi, the Kenyan philosopher, states, he heard the voices in his own language of Gikyu, but wrote them down in English sounds. Thus, the original text, which is not written down but exists only in our mind, is lost and is only visible in the form of the mask of English language. Our socialization of thinking and thereby speaking and writing in an imposed language like English take away from our very being the essence of our own language. So, what do we do when the very form of our own language, the core of one's culture, becomes alien to us? However, in the decolonized epistemological spaces, which may not subscribe to the Western hegemonic languages, there might also be a threat of erasure of alternate or non-majoritarian languages. For example, in a linguistically diverse country like India, where many states have adopted Hindi as the primary language, the many different dialects and scripts of minority groups and tribes eventually become just an oral form of communication within the community. And in most cases, even they go extinct. So when it comes to enriching the body of knowledge in local languages, the ones who write it in English mostly do not care to translate their own works in their own local language. Hence, there's a certain parochialization when it comes to translating scholarly works into peripheral languages, leading to the crucial problem of access to knowledge across barriers of dominant language. Thus, in the process of linguistic decoloniality and going beyond the Western languages, conserving one's native language becomes important. Along with language, one needs to acknowledge one's geopolitical roots of thought. So, our situated and constructed knowledge, what we think, how we think, why we think, and what we think, are an outcome of dominant racial, that is caste or dominant ethnicity or religion, and body politics, which have chained us to certain these frameworks of imagery in terms of us versus them, or soul versus body, or Occident versus Orient. So to define ourselves beyond these ingrained images of us, and to look at our own cultures without the prism of the West is a form of complex unlearning. So according to Mignolo, one way of this unlearning is epistemic disobedience. So creating knowledge from spaces considered inferior, uncivilized, and places of non-thought. Here he means that to study our own experiences and to learn from other experiences from the global South, we need to dissociate from the West, or change the terms of the conversation. So our aim here should not be to annihilate the West imposed binaries, because that is an impossibility in itself, but to acknowledge the paradoxes and still coexist with it. Um, so This awareness of our colonial self extends to the awareness of the intricate means through which categories of race, caste, gender, identity have perpetuated the Eurocentric neoliberal domination. So, as Anibal Quijano states, a social redistribution of power can counter the coloniality of power. So, for this redistribution, our thought processes need to be diversalized in the form of South-South dialogue, in which philosophies from global South address each other directly without deferring to the authority of dominant Eurocentric philosophy. Uh, One needs to consciously commit to non-West pluriversality, as Mignolo states, to contest the hegemony of zero-point epistemology. Now, this zero-point epistemology refers to Europe, or specifically Western Europe in the traditional intellectual sense, as the point of origin of all that we know. We need to reconstruct what we mean by modern, beyond Eurocentric modernity, and thereby unlearn our thought processes. So to do this, first of all, we need to get over the phobia of decoloniality. So it is not just dominant discourses that are an outcome of colonial or neo-colonial forms of living that we see now in neoliberal and nationalistic ideologies. But these forms of oppressive and exploitative processes are also inherently, they possess a form of phobia that seeps into the psyche of the colonized. To overcome this colonially induced phobia of owning our own tradition and cultures, one needs to decolonize the mind and thereby the self. So what I mean by decoloniality of the mind here is that it is about being aware of the values of Western culture and how we are influenced by it, and also being aware of the native culture and how we can go back to inculcating the long lost identity that we now associate with shame, violence, embarrassment, even. So, in this process of conscious awareness and bringing about new form of collective being, it is not just about textual uh, learnings. It is also about self-change or looking within and questioning our everyday living, beliefs and values that drive our personal actions and agency. It is about the ability to self-critique, as only then can men write about men without the accompanying threat of bias, for example. Uh, so knowledge here needs to be seen not in writing, but in the act of thinking, feeling, intentionality, and internalization of what is happening around us. To be able to think authentically, one needs to address the issues or challenges of hypocrisy and bias within the intellectual spaces and within our own selves, most importantly. While we are talking about decolonizing the mind, we should ask, why are we doing this? Is it for knowledge or for our own self, or for merely the appreciation in the intellectual spaces? Or are we using these jargons to pathologize and legitimize in the eyes of quote unquote white? Or does knowledge and ontology have any life in it? Can we feel the essence of it? Is it alleviating the oppression, or is it merely attempting to spice up the otherwise drab and bland taste of traditional theory by talking about non-mainstream and non-hegemonic discourses? Our very endeavors to write and publish talk in English within modern institutions originating from the Enlightenment are exercises in specific form of modernity that can never be our own. If we are to study our own knowledge system, we should first acknowledge who are we doing it for and for whose validation. So one of the significant forms of unlearning is through Enric Dussel's ethical hermeneutics as a methodology of being. It involves a sacred fear and respect before the other as other. It is neither sympathy, which remains bound to the ethos of the same, what we call it, not love of friendship, which demands mutuality, but rather the habit of creatively putting oneself forward without seeking reciprocity, gratitude, or gratification. It consists in the confidence in other, faith in the other's future and liberty, accrediting the truth of the other's word, and also denying any possibility that one can have total comprehension of the other. So, in this attitude, one affirms the existence of another culture in the supposedly uncultured, or what is known as illiterate culture. So Dussel here is talking about locating the self in the hermeneutic position of the oppressed and take on their interests, thereby discovering previously unnoticed values and opening the horizon of the possible constitution of objects of knowledge, often invisible to those lodged within the hegemonic totality. A whole new critical perspective, a new criterion of philosophical and historical interpretation, a new fundamental hermeneutics, typical of the Gramsci type organic intellectual, can now be perceived. Dussel comments on this approach to hermeneutics in one of his theological writings. So he says, a beggar, for example, sees the color on the outside of the rich man's house from the outside, something the rich man on the inside doesn't see. We have a better view of the house of the center because we live on the outside. We are stronger, but we are not stronger, but weaker. But in this case, weakness is an asset. Our theology engages in criticism of the theology of the center precisely because ours is a theology of the periphery. Therefore, it is a theology that will clearly propose critical points of support for Latin America, but also for Arab world, for Africa, India, China, for the Blacks and Chicanos of Northern America, etc. So Dussel, in fact, defines the philosophy of liberation as being not a theoretical option, but rather a practical political option for the poor, a more moral commitment to the other, open to a plurality of theoretical categorizations, for example, Frankfurt School, Marxism, Levinasian metaphysics, etc., and even political options. So there is thus an increased understanding of the other, resulting from commitment to them. So Dussel even suggests that this process of understanding the other through deculturation of oneself is achieved through a kind of secondary socialization at the hands of the other. So coming to another way of being, that is subaltern and Dalit ways of being. Within South Asia, this refers to within South Asia, the dominant or hegemonic forms of learning are not just Western theories, but the elite historiography within South Asia also forms a hegemonic knowledge system. So, and this has historically excluded the politics of the people, which the historian Ramchandra Guha states. The elite theorizations, the South Asian intellectuals educated in the West, do not talk about the struggles and mobilization of masses that happen across the colonized spaces of South Asia. And hence, one needs to question who speaks and who listens. So as Guha states, the Indian bourgeoisie failed to speak for the nation. They failed to speak about the experience of exploitation of the subaltern. And ultimately, it was a failure of the nation to come to its own. We can see this even today as in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. So they are no longer colonized, yet the same colonial processes of political rule, administration, economic development are still imbibed today as they were during the British rule. So the emphasis on the experience of subaltern and theories emanating from what they see, what they feel, and how they experience things form the core of subaltern thought. This method of theorizing from the vantage point of the subaltern is a form of counter-hegemonic theorizing. Nevertheless, one also needs to acknowledge that this knowledge, even though drawn from the experiences of the marginalized, does nothing to change the lived realities of the oppressed themselves. Nor are these knowledge systems available or accessible in the native language to these communities. So it is not enough to just talk about them. In India, there has historically been a domination of Brahminical form of Hinduism, in which a particular group or caste, as we call it, known as Brahmins, have historically oppressed the other lower castes and indigenous tribes, the effects of which are still visible today. So if religion in the form of Brahminical Hinduism was oppressive in the past, today a new religion in the form of capitalism has emerged that is dominated by the bourgeoisie through ideologies of modernity, civilization, and development. In India, we see Brahminical Hinduism has merged with capitalism to further alienate the subalterns, the Dalits, and the tribal population. Dalit scholars and activists like Ambedkar, Periyar, and Phule, to name a few, have talked about the life-destructive effects of blind belief of religion and its ritualistic practices on the lower castes and tribes in India. It is similar to the marginalization of indigenous inhabitants in the West as well. In this context, social reformer Phule, Jyotirao Phule, who in the 19th century started primary and higher education of the oppressed, including women, and that time it was a radical action, and campaigned for the rights of the lower caste. For him, collective transformation of the social structure could eliminate caste discrimination, blind superstition in the name of religion, and caste inequality in society. Similarly, Periyar, he's an Indian political activist who started the self-respect movement in the 20th century to put a stop to caste discrimination. So true freedom, he believed, lies in self-freedom. The political freedom that India was vying for neither allowed an individual to marry a person of their choice without consequences, nor did it allow for widows to be remarried. The self-respect movement fought for all these rights. It saw the backward castes and women on the street demanding their social rights for the first time, and in the process enabled social mobility of the marginalized. Similarly, Ambedkar also argued for not just social reform as a means to equality and self-determination of the lower castes in India, but also emphasized on ideological reform. The tradition of caste has prevented the Hindus from becoming a united, harmonious society with a consciousness of its own being. Hence, going back to the tradition is essential, no doubt, but it is also essential to realize that some traditions can be equally oppressive, exploitative, and dehumanizing as colonial capitalism. And critically looking at the past is more urgent than ever. Further, the massive colonization processes historically and in contemporary times have over the years brought about a cultural discontinuity, which has been replaced by the fancy and appealing terms of globalization and cosmopolitanism today. So the subaltern languages, for example, which were the essence and core of indigenous cultures, still exist today, but have been eroded of their essence and significance, consciously or unconsciously. Of course, the decolonial processes in the global south, which do actively engage in countering the colonial education, colonial knowledge systems of science, or the popular culture that we consume, and art through the promotion of classical art and dance and music forms. And even in South Asia, we find the widespread use of and development of Ayurvedic or Unani medicinal knowledge and practices, do in a way also neocolonize or recolonize the geopolitical space of operation by suppressing or neglecting other forms of knowledges, like the many forms of tribal or minority communities, their cultures and ways of living. So decolonial thinking is essential not just to create a body of epistemologies, but it is all. But it's also to diminish or further prevent intergenerational trauma, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and even systemic or domestic violence that occur because of the dominance of hegemonically heteronormative superiors and their accustomed ways of being. So another way of being that we have included here is the indigenous way of being. And this is probably more familiar for the ones watching. Tayake Alfred, in his book on Peace, Power, and Righteousness, an Indigenous Manifesto, points out the historical injustice meted out to indigenous inhabitants, and talks about its remedy in the principle of self-determination. This principle is rooted in the collective rights of the indigenous inhabitants with respect to their land, resources, and sovereignty. Alfred says sovereignty is a state of mind. You think like a nation, like a sovereign people or a sovereign person. This exercise of the right of the indigenous or the marginalized or the oppressed is a challenge for the oppressed in every society today. So the challenge is not just about the limited external resources through which they can fight, but also the challenge resides within the mind. How far can we get over our fears, the colonial phobia of the colonized that is manifested in the West toxicated actions of the self? So the cure to this phobia of getting out of the modern capitalist comfort lies in engaging with the values of the traditional knowledge systems. We need to renew our relationship with our own communities, renewed activism, and a renewed leadership ethos to bring an end to a harmful way of life imposed on us by history. So all actions in this effort, not just our own, but those of everyone who support us, must be inspired and guided by four principles. So he talks about four principles. That is, first, we need to undermine the intellectual premises of colonialism. Second, we need to act on the moral imperative for change. Third, uh, we should not cooperate with colonialism in any form. Fourth and last, we need to resist further injustice. Um, so Alfred says decolonization can be achieved if one imbibes these four principles. So the process of decolonizing our way of thinking is intrinsic to this overall process of decolonial living. As Alfred says, the youth of today have the potential to undertake the perpetuation of an indigenous intelligentsia. So this includes re-establishment of respect for knowledge in all its forms, beyond the Western modern rational knowledge. So one of the major consequences of colonialism was the loss of our ability to think for ourselves. And many of our leaders and community rely on others to think for them for a price. The cost of delegating intelligence is enormous in terms of misrepresentation or misappropriation of indigenous knowledge and perspectives. Um, People who can shape ideas, translate, and create knowledge or language will be essential to the process of decolonization once we have created an informed and critical polity by increasing the general level of education in our communities. So structural and psychological decolonization is an intellectual process as well as a political, social, and spiritual one. So the next way of knowing is the Kaupapa Maori. This intellectual process focuses on expanding the research on Maori culture, which is an indigenous tribe in New Zealand, by motivating indigenous inhabitants to research their own culture and thereby increase their own consciousness about their indigenous roots and responsibilities. Linda Tuhai Smith, in her book on decolonizing methodologies, talks about how production of Western knowledge in the nature of academic work, in the production of theories, have dehumanized Maori and in practices have continued to privilege Western ways of knowing. At the same time, denying the validity for Maori of Maori knowledge, language, and culture. One of the challenges for Maori researchers working in this context has been to retrieve some space to convince Maori people of the value of research for the Maori people. Second, to convince the various fragmented but powerful research communities of the need for greater Maori involvement in research. And the third, to develop approaches and ways of carrying out research which take into account the legacies of previous research and the parameters of both previous and current approaches. So this Kaupapa Maori research is an attempt to retrieve that space and to achieve these general aims for sustaining Maori culture and traditional value system. So Nepe argues that Kaupapa Maori is a conceptualization of Maori knowledge. It is a way of abstracting that knowledge, reflecting on it, engaging with it, taking it for granted sometimes as well, making assumptions based on it, and at times critically engaging in the way it has been and is being constructed. There's the possibility within Kaupapa Maori research to address the different constructions of Maori knowledge. A good example of this is the development of Maori women's theories about Maori society, which questions the accounts of Maori society provided by men, including Maori men, but which still hold to a position that argues that the issues of gender for Maori do not make us the same as white women. So the critical theory of Kaupapa Maori also applies therefore to Maori ways of thinking, ways of doing things, but it does not deny either the existence of or fundamental legitimacy to Maori people of Maori forms of knowledge. So next, we turn to Buddhist philosophy of living. So although Buddhism as a religious practice seems to have assimilated itself within capitalism through the various meditation practices and breathing exercises that we consume today, but the essence of Buddhism is not always embodied in the manifested rituals as we see, but Buddha's teaching, if analyzed closely, gave us a philosophy of living that is not based on blind belief, but on seeing, knowing, and understanding. So Buddha, in his advice to Kalamas, says it is right to have doubt about what we hear or what we are told. Do not be led by reports, tradition, or hearsay. Be not led by the authority of religious texts, he says, nor by mere logic or inference, nor by considering appearances, nor by the delight in speculative opinions. So he also says that when you know for yourself that certain things are unwholesome, or what Buddha terms as akusala, and wrong and bad, then give them up. And when you know for yourself that certain things are wholesome, that is kusala, and good, then accept them and follow them. Buddha also tells his disciples that they should examine even the Tathagata, that is Buddha himself, so that the disciple might be fully convinced of the true value of what the teacher is saying, whom he is following. So when a student works, for example, on a mathematical problem, he comes to a stage beyond which he does not know how to proceed, and where he is in doubt and perplexity. As long as he has this doubt, he cannot proceed. If he wants to proceed, he must resolve this doubt. And there are ways of resolving that doubt. Just to say, I believe or I do not doubt will not solve the problem. To force oneself to believe and to accept a thing without understanding is political and not spiritual or intellectual. So, some of the claims of knowledge that Buddha criticizes are the authority of the Vedic tradition, a tradition in general, not necessarily Vedic, or the scriptures in general, which are a collection of sacred sayings, or testimony of experts, or reports, or hearsay. So a tradition may be sometimes true and sometimes false, and hence is a context and subject dependent. And hence a religion is not entirely false, even if its revelation may be invalid, as is said by Buddha in the Kanki Sutta. So what is probably meant is that a tradition, or revelation, or report may be well remembered or ill remembered. And even if well remembered, it may be true or false, for the reliability in the transmission of tradition is no guarantee of its intrinsic truth. Buddha says that one should not blindly believe anything, like the unilinear idea of development that we are fed with by the West, or that we are inherently inferior, or colonization is a civilizing mission. So these sort of beliefs, we need to de-occidentize ourselves. So Buddha's teachings on self-criticism, self-reflexivity, doubting and questioning what we are told, and then letting our inner moral compass judge the right and wrong without bias, can be said to be ontologically decolonial. But in this process, one needs to also ask, how do we let go of our colonial perceptions and status quo to think and act differently? It is a constant struggle with the self and the comfort of familiarity. But as Buddha says, as long as we are doubting everything around us, that means we are thinking critically and being aware of what is right and wrong. In this process, the direct personal knowledge of the self is engaged with the actuality of the real, without any dependence on hegemonic knowledge systems or authoritarian scriptures. So when the mind is concentrated or cleansed, free from blemishes, defilements, as Buddha says, the mind in this state is said to observe introspectively. And this is one of the ways in which the mind can unlearn, by introspecting. So now I will request my colleague Zunayed to move on to unlearning politics and the third section. Thank you.
Thank you, Magna. I would like to begin on the notion of politics and sovereignty of this this modern hopeless time. So as we all know that like Eric Fromm points out that like modern man has chosen to become a cog in a machine, and he has chosen a life which is well clothed and well fed, and therefore his freedom has been surrendered. He has lost his freedom and become an automation in this machine. Though we have all the modern myths such as freedom, fundamental rights, rule of law, and so on that spoon feed and helps us to stay in this stage of delusion. In general, the politics as it is has disappeared, yet the theatrical performance of it continues. If we observe the political performance even in the authoritarian regime, we see a certain kind of module is being followed. This module has instilled a political rationality which does not have anything to do with the ontological status of politics itself. This political rationality has been termed as biopolitics by Foucault, where he states biopolitics takes control over life to put life in order, and that's how life becomes the subject of it. According to Mbembe, we have turned into living death in a dead world where subjugation of the power of death is an inevitable part of our life. In this condition where life is at the stake, we need to seek radical questioning on the ground of politics. Recent US presidential election has proved us again that we don't have any alternatives beyond choosing the lesser evil. Intellectuals like Noam Chomsky to Cornel West expressed their strategic support to Joe Biden that portrays a restaurant where the menu contains only two items. One is slow poison and another one is rapid poison. For Hannah Arendt, the relation between the lesser and the greater evil is more than intimate, as instead of protecting us from the greater evil, the lesser one leads us toward the greater one. If choosing the lesser evil in every 4 years, sending culprits to the parliament and then asking rights from them are the meaning of politics this time, we need to start rethinking about it has already lost the spirit within it. When we talk about politics, the first task is to make it clear what do we mean by politics. Alan Badiou dismisses the Machiavellian definition of politics, which is all about a sovereign art of lying for the lust of power. On the contrary, he advocates politics as a journey towards the truth, and which entails the idea of justice. This philosophical reorientation counters the tendency of not questioning the existing framework of politics, which does not have any foundation in truth. The reason perhaps is obvious, as our presupposed idea of politics is far away from the idea of politics as it is, so as our idea of life. We have surrendered our freedom and become a cog in a machine, what Marx would say the loss of self, and performing the animal functions only in politics. For the resurrection of self, which is essential for becoming a political subject, one needs to uphold the work of death, which means to assume death and simultaneously live with the assumption of death. The confrontation with death and coexisting with the assumption of it is the life of spirit, according to a Hegelian paradigm, distinguishes man from animal, and that creates the possibility of sovereign political subject. In this spiritless modern time, where the fundamental understanding of life is missing, politics has become an act of clamor with an empty conceptualization. For, for Carl Smith, nothing is more modern than the onslaught against the political. The idea of sovereignty has been segregated from the idea of politics. He defines sovereign, which is the source of becoming a political subject, as who takes the decision on the state of exception. But in reality, we see the state's sovereign power over citizens that reserves the power over life. In the parliamentary democracy, politics is merely a tool of choosing between multiple so-called democratic options and give legitimacy to exercise over power over life. One might claim himself innocent not for choosing the greater evil, but the very act of participation in this mechanism gives the monsters to mandate of exercising sovereign power. Therefore, we need to rethink the resurrecting our lost sovereignty as human being, because this is the primary concern for being a political subject. The modern sovereign state has been established by the means of a state of exception. Even if we think we are living in the age of democracy, but actually it's nothing less than a permanent state of exception. As per Agamben, the judiciary allows the state to eliminate both political opponent and the portion of people who can't be integrated into the political system. So the legal system we have today might appear to be the normal condition, but this is an absolute emergency situation in itself. State has the monopoly to set the common interest of the community and can slender anyone as anti-national. Therefore, state has become a sovereign entity by the means of the subjugation of its own people. Weber defines modern state as a monopoly of juridical violence within the given territory. If that is so, we need to seek the answer why we tend to surrender our sovereign power to something that we have created. Partly because we have lost our self-defense mechanism, and that was possible as we refuse to accept life as it is and desire to have a juridical or constitutional life. If state as an organization has the monopoly of juridical violence, political ends should be to restore the sovereignty of the people. But what is the means for that end? Is there anything that justify the end? For Benjamin, juridical violence aims to make law and preserve it. He terms it as mythical violence as the precondition of this force is based on false ontology. He advocates divine violence as force to counter mythical violence. If the latter one is for lawmaking, the former stands for law destroying. If mythical violence threatens and set boundaries, divine violence strikes and breaks it. For the sake of the living, divine violence is pure power over all life, whereas for its own sake, mythical violence is bloody power over mere life. However, to counter the juridical violence, one needs to have enormous spirit. But the danger of this strange time is that we don't even have that. The spiritless condition for Smith is the result of the age of technicity, and the irresistible power of technology has made an ingenious but soulless generation. As the concept of the modern state theory are all secularized theological concepts, therefore it has lost the meanings so as the strength and force to counter the dynamic power of this age. Smith's scheme has been resonated in Foucault's observation on Iranian revolution in 1979. Against the oppressive Shah regime, people choose death rather than living a vegetated life of slavery, where theology played a crucial role to create the enigma of uprising. But according to Talal Asad, as the modern sovereign state has secularized theological concept in its foundation, political tradition has been separated from religious authority. It's not necessary that political theology would bring a better future for us without the foundation in truth, which is singularity coexisting in plural form. It will create or it can create another dictatorship. Therefore, it must have the notion of creating a just world for all, not being trapped in the paradox of inventing enemy. In the history of modern South Asia, we have some towering spiritual leaders who had the spirit of politics and did realize the importance of the sovereignty of humans. Most importantly, they perceived politics as a way of life and not as a mere theatrical performance. They did politics for the purpose of seeking truth and did not differentiate humans based on the constructed meanings. In a way, throughout their life and works, we might find the idea of universal humanity and coexistence for a pluralistic society which has the ability to offer an alternative politics beyond the infinite paradox of enemy invention. Maulana Abdul Hamid Khan Bhashani was one of them who throughout his life fought for the cause of toiling masses, oppressed peasants with the oppositional political spirit, and is known as the prophet of violence. The most influential but overlooked idea of Maulana Bhashani is the philosophy of Rububiyya, which means providence, the philosophy of providence, and that was the latent structure throughout his long political life. Before moving forward, I would like to spend some time on what exactly the word Rububiyya stands for. So Rububiyya is an Arabic word derived from Rab, which means Lord of all being. Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, who was an Islamic theologian from Indian subcontinent, translated the word Rububiyya as providence or nourishment. He suggests that in Arabic, the word Rububiyya stands for nourishing, yet it has to be considered in a wide sense according to the opinions of some leading lexicographers. For them, Rububiyya means to develop a thing from stage to stage in accordance with its inherent aptitudes, needs, and its different aspects of existence, and also in a manner affording the existential freedom to it to attain its full stature. For example, feeding the hungry or giving alms to the poor might be an expression of kindness, but this is not what Rububiyya means. Rather, Rububiyya or the providence is a process of caring or nourishment which has to be provided from stage to stage to fulfill the fullest possible well-being of the needy one. This is the spirit of Rububiyya, where nourishment or providence has to be continuous process in every situation and every stage. So Maulana Bhashani emphasizes a verse from Quran where God saying, quote, "Nothing on the planet on earth or earth I created without reason, but most of them don't even know it," unquote. So he interprets the verse arguing that for the protective nature of God, he not only created all these things, but nourishes them as well. Therefore, as a creation of God, we have to nourish the other. We must have care for the other. So now, how can we envision Rubabia or the philosophy of providence as a theory of coexistence in this time of constant othering? According to Nandi, South Asia is the only region in the world where most states define themselves not by what they are, but by what they are not. I want to quote a song from Lalun Sai, who was a prominent Baul saint from Bengal. Quote, "Four colors in a single flower. How strangely beautiful that flowers make the city of love," unquote. But the present condition of the world we are facing, where the different colors and their constructed meanings has become the source of hatred instead of love. Instead of Lalon Shai's imaginative city of love, we have got the city of hate. There is no harm being different from neighbors. There is no harm to have different identities as long as there is respect and compassion for the others and seeing others within ourselves. But why is there an increasing inability to this form of coexistence with others? Have we reached into the conclusion that the other as a potential threat all the time? The concept of modern nation state is not different from our idea of what is a potential threat if we observe global politics in contemporary times. We can't see the other as a positive energy or as someone who is not an other, but as one among us. And we can't perceive diversity as an essential forces of our existence. Hence, we tend to invent a constant enemy for legitimizing our existence in the form of discrimination, violence, and mass killings of who we perceive to be the other. We are no longer interested in communicating with the other within our own self. To further make sense of this, we can take recourses of the parable of six blind men and the elephant in the Buddhist tradition that teaches us the unity of being and how the other contribute the knowledge to create the whole truth, and without them, every truth is partial. In this philosophy of Rubabia or the providence, we find the concept of universal plurality when God claims in or where God claims, quote, "I have made you into nations and tribes. I have made you into different nations and tribes, and the noblest among you is the most deeply conscious of God," unquote. Across time and space, the notion of unity and coexistence is present, and it has been extensively elaborated in South Asia as well. Unfortunately, the tradition and history of our part of the world is silent, but we need to make it speak. Not necessarily we are liberating or giving voice to our tradition or history, but in this process, we are giving voice to ourselves, freeing ourselves from the black hole of our ahistoricism. The maxim, "love thy neighbor as thyself," can only be possible if one can encounter the inner egoism. Maulana Bhashani takes one term from Islamic tradition that means hukumat rabbaniya, that means divine rule, to oppose the order of egoism. The word nafsaniyat came from the Arabic word nafs, which means soul. Therefore, hukumat nafsaniyat is all about egocentricity and selfhood, and that leads us to spiritual poverty. In this earthly life, humans have material needs, but at the same time, they need spiritual cognition. Maulana Bhashani emphasizes on establishing the divine rule to fulfill both earthly and spiritual desire of all the people, regardless of their religion. Everyone can develop spiritual cognition from their own religious philosophy. If one carefully analyzes different verses from Quran, such as, quote, "I have made you in different nations and tribes," and if God had willed, he would have made you a single community, but his will to test you with what he has given each of you. So compete with one another in doing good, and nothing is this in this earth I have created without reason. So all these verses is a clear that there is a clear sign of universal pluralism, and that diversity and the diversity among us is intentional. One needs to seek oneself to the light of the others. now I will spend some time on how the philosophy of Rubabia, or the philosophy of providence, provides us an antidote to the colonial understanding of sovereignty. Maulana Bhashani advocates God as the only sovereign entity instead of state. Therefore, to nourish the creature of God, one have to abolish the existing structural oppression. He advocates "Fukka kulla nizamin." This is an Arabic phrase, and that means abolish any kind of social, economical, and political structure of oppression. So he argues rebellion against any kind of oppression is the teaching of Islam. He criticizes Gandhi's spell of non-violence, who in Hindi, in India, it's called ahimsa. So that means non-violence as a method of transformation. The ideology of non-violence incapacitates the collective power of people. Non-violence is the opium of people, which keeps them in illusion and sustains the oppression. Freedom from exploitation can be achieved through rebellion, but the idea of ahimsa or non-violence destroys the revolutionary spirit. So this political philosophy is the revolution is the only path. So he argues talks between the oppressor and the oppressed never benefit the latter. It is always the oppressor who wins the negotiating table. That's how Maulana Bhashani tries to counter the hegemonic concept of state sovereignty and tries to restore the lost sovereignty from theology. As a means to that ends, he advocates violence, which resonates Benjamin's concept of divine violence. In this age of territorial nationalism, the philosophy of Rubabia, or the philosophy of nourishment, has the potentiality to imagine a counter narrative or counter imagination against the idea of modern nation state. Maulana Bhashani's philosophy of nourishment framed the potential for an alternative world that can bridge sectarian discrimination, communal conflicts, and institutional violence if understood and exercised in its essence. It is not just a moral dictum, but a theory of living together with the potential to be put into practice that proposes a new cartography of South Asia along with a pluriversal civilizational appeal. So now I will move, this is the end of this section. So I will move the conclusion part of this paper, that the title is A Critical Inquiry of the Notion of Decoloniality of this time. So so far that like we have talked about that, like how to like we have talked some ontological diversal ontologies and so on. So now that like we need to be careful about that, like when we use the term that decoloniality, because there might be some problem can arise in the future. So our theorizing and our living needs to situate collective empathy, instinctual humanism, and the philosophy of emancipation at its core. The ethical intellectual activity that is authentic and appeals to life itself can only emerge when we attempt to consciously unlearn and live beyond the colonial habituated patterns of being. In our part of the world, the term decolonialism has become the new fancy, and the intellectuals who constantly parrot related terminology are most often untouched from the critical scrutiny. The spell of academic jargons masquerades the intimate and internal coloniality, and therefore they appear as the messiah of the colonized. We must acknowledge that the decolonial pen, this term I took from Nagugi. So this decolonial pen, with all its revolutionary terminologies, might cut the tongue of its own people, as people's everyday existence has become untouchable to some of them. Before language, there is thought, and before thought, there is experience. The duty of critical analysis, therefore, is to understand the experience and the formation of thought rather than the language of decolonialism. During colonial times, the term decolonialism was not imprisoned in the academic arena. Rather, it was a concept of the oppressed masses. The concept, with all its subversive nature, touched the existence of the people and therefore was loaded with the idea of people's liberation. Even many decolonial thinkers were not so-called academics or intellectuals, rather they were the outsiders of the framework of modern academia. For example, I can say some names from this South Asia, which might be like a bit unfamiliar. This Titumir or Haji Shariatullah or Dudumia or many other people who fought against the British colonialism in Indian subcontinent. The colonial subject has faded away from the theory of decolonialism. It has been alienated from its home and is now performing as a jockey for recognition from the master. But the whole idea of decolonialism was the denial of the masters and fight for self-recognition. Now we write, but we don't have the agency or authority to choose the color of ink. We talk as our silence is not recognized. We desire to be seen in the space of core as periphery is invisible to them. In the most obedient nature, we do epistemic disobedience. Colonial slave, with its clamorous performance, appears as the decolonial subject, and the true decolonial subject, for its tranquil silence, appears as the slave. In the world of constant noise, we are no longer interested in studying the silence. Silence has perceived as non-existence. The inner existential crisis of us has created a world where we no longer have communication with the silence of people. We reproduce words but fail to have conversation with wordlessness. The colonial matrix of power unveils the many layers of the colonized identity that are in constant dialectics between the Western construction of the self and the decolonial construction of the self. To emerge from the colonial influences of power in the form of the decolonized self, a radical reimagination of the process of knowledge production is required. For Nagogi, imagination is a central agency. As he argues, an architect visualizes a building before he captures it on paper. It is true that an architect need imagination, but we need to ask the question of why the architect has a certain kind of imagination. If we see all this modern architecture, imagination as a category is not innocent and apolitical in nature. Therefore, we need to revisit our imagination and try to find the political base of our imaginative structure. Before imagination, we need political commitment to people. Before art, we need the canvas of the people. In a world full of oppression, there can't be any free imagination, and we must keep aside the idea for a world free of oppression. The problem is when we theorize, or when we talk about decoloniality, we cannot imagine going beyond the Western epistemological frameworks, and we have an inherent yearnings to be legitimized by the Eurocentric spaces of knowledge production. Hence, in our pursuit of being the colonial slave, we are constrained into a form of intellectual straitjacketing of theorizing of decoloniality. This straitjacket gives us the illusion of being a thinking subject, whereas in reality, we are no different than the laborer who operates machinery to produce output. We operate the machinery of traditional theory to produce the empirically fixed output. To come out of this intellectual confinement, a form of epistemic violence is needed that can be employed in our thought process to mold our decolonial self. Mignolo's epistemic disobedience assumes a delinkage from the imposed Westoxication in the production of knowledge. Hence, the knowledge needs to be delinked from the Eurocentric idea of modernity, humanity, secularism, progress, and economic growth, and so other terminology of this modern time. But in doing so, if we don't encounter our presupposed idea of knowledge, which derived from the West, then the epistemic violence masquerades the epistemic obedience. Our thought remains in chains by the colonial epistemologies of knowledge, though we might enjoy the narcissistic feeling of decolonization. For a moment, consider wild animals who are outsider of the modern civilization, and inherently they have epistemic disobedience. They were never linked, but in modern times we have this safari park where they feel that they are free, but in reality they are the victims of modern man's narcissistic vulgar pleasure. Likewise, in the name of delinking, some of us tend to link the subject who were never linked at the first place, and thus an academic safari park is in making. So we need to be careful about these things. The colonization of thought process can be done in a consciously critical approach by negotiating with and encountering the ideological and epistemological boundaries of Western notions of universalism and modernity to connote more than one way of comprehending our lived realities. It accompanies with it an understanding of the historical trajectory of geopolitics from the epistemological construction of what we know today as modern Europe and modernity originating all the way from Renaissance. Once we are explicitly aware of the fiction that frames Europe as the center of the world system, we can, according to Dussel, we can then go about imagining the contours of an alternate planetary consciousness that is diversal, globalistic, and transmodern. This consciousness can be realized in the form of a good living or buen vivir. I am using the Santos terms here, good living, wherein we create our ways and means of knowing through the people, and it is an attempt at reclaiming the mana, which means our standing in our own ways, in our own eyes, that centuries of colonization had annihilated. This form of living is about going beyond imperialist subservient ways of understanding and consciously staying with the discomfort of unlearning status quist ontologies. We hope we were able to give a brief overview of our paper. I'm going to end here. Thank you all for listening, and thank you, Professor Carl and Professor Roger, to give us the opportunity to share our thought.
Great. Thank you, Zunayed and Magna. We have just slightly over 15 minutes for this session. So if anybody has any questions, you can either write them into the chat and I'll read them aloud, or just signal into the chat that you have a question and I can call on you and you can ask your question yourselves.
I'd like to ask a question to our panelists. It was fascinating to listen to that. And my question comes from this. It gets down to what came up yesterday about the distinction between the decolonial and the post-colonial. In many ways, historically, decolonial theory is an effort to go beyond the post-colonial, which we all know had its kind of its theater of generation within India after Indian independence in the late 1940s and so forth, or in the 50s and 60s. And so the Indian experience in its complexity, its historical richness, had a lot to do with kind of, you might say, over time, developing the process, the way of thinking that became decolonial thinking. And I found it very intriguing the way, particularly Magna was referring to modern India and all the different kind of tribal epistemes that exist there and so forth. So I guess my question comes down to, we heard a lot yesterday about speaking about decoloniality from the Western Hemisphere experience, but you're speaking about it from the South Asia. And so my question is, in what degree do you see these different kind of projects that are coming from local sites? Of course, that's part of decoloniality, is to, really emphasize the local, not just abstract the local into some notion, that fits with everybody else. I don't know if you heard much of the conversation yesterday, but do you see a significant difference or similarities between what is being talked about in the Western Hemisphere and what is discussed in South Asia? This is not just to Magna, it's to both of you.
Zunayed, would you like to go or should I go?
You can.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Karl, for the question. So, yes, while we were reading about these theories, even from the South Asian vantage point and from the indigenous American vantage points, we could see the similarity because what Tayake Alfred talks about self-determination and sovereignty, these are some of the issues that the tribal population here in South Asia also faces. So we have these acts for them, like the Forest Rights Act, which sort of confines them to a geographical space within which these tribes have to stay and they have to they do not even have the freedom over their own economic production. So whatever they produce, they have to give it to the state. So everything belongs to the state. So this kind of this constrained sort of living is something which we have read and heard about the indigenous population in the West. So yes, there is a lot of similarities there. And I think your other thing was how post-coloniality is different from decoloniality, if I'm not wrong. So I think post-coloniality in its manifestation here is more about the political administrative aspect of these colonized post-colonial countries. But when we are talking about decoloniality, I think it is more I think it's more deeper or more wider, in the sense of what maybe Anibal Quijano also says, that is there is a colonial matrix of power, that is like it can be decoloniality here can be seen through our cultures, our in language, which is more than what the traditional post-colonial meaning of the term says. I think uh, that's what I can think of for now.
Thank you.
Zunayed, did you want to respond to Carl as well?
I think I have something to say on this. Thank you for this like interesting question. So I see it in here this here the problem is that like maybe that like we know that like there is something like very weird in this like South Asia, like all that like especially like I'm from Bangladesh, so maybe like India is like bit different, but in Bangladesh like what happens that like this when this like this decolonial or like this kind of terms come, so even this within this like decolonial frame there is a tendency of that like this west toxicated knowledge, like what like Jalal Ahmad, like from Persian philosopher, so who say that like the plague from the west. So so this is a kind of like a tuberculosis, like a disease that like which like for the disease that like whatever you think or like say you just like obey the epistemologies from the West. So so even that like they talk about this this decoloniality and all these kind of things. So there is a tendency of that like becoming this academic elite, or like in Indian terms is Brahmins, academic Brahmins, and this like people who are the margins or who are the oppressed, they become the empirical Shudras or empirical lower class. So they is kind of like becoming a tools or becoming a kind of like is a kind of that like another like I can call it like academic operation or something, that like that there is a like division that like, so the thing is that like the margins of the oppressed can't talk, so I need to be the messiah of them and I need to talk for them. So but at the same time that like we need to ask that like why they don't have voice, that also that like I don't know that like what happens in the outside of South Asia or like somewhere, but that is I wanted to add.
Thank you.
Jared, there's a question that was sent
Yeah.
by Carl Militore to me directly. I don't know if you saw it.
No.
Okay, I'll read it out because I'm not the
Okay.
moderator. It says, the question to Magna, would you please explain more about the following expression, blind faith? I don't know, Carlos, would you like to unmute yourself and maybe elaborate a little bit? Talk to them directly. If you could unmute yourself. No. I'm having a problem here. All right.
Hello.
Yeah, okay.
Well, my English is not very good, so I am able to write short phrases. Yeah, I like very much the position of Magna. I understand that the Buddhists are have a deep soul, no, and they're very wise, no. So I like that expression. I just would like to hear more about this. I am Christian, but I believe that we must be free of thinking. No? The Asian books, like the Bible, are very good, but the humanity is living more time and the wisdom is changing. No? So please, that's the question. It's a positive question. I'm not trying to say nothing against you. It's okay.
Thanks, Carlos, for the question, but I'm sorry, I'm not able to get what exactly is the question. Jared, if you could repeat the question.
Define faith. I think that's what the question is. I'm not sure of the context, but will you use it? Does that ring a bell?
No, maybe let me explain more. For the Christian people, it's very important, no, the knowledge that comes from sacred books, like the Bible, no. So that could be called blind faith. Okay, maybe it's interesting, the questions. But I don't know how in Buddhist tradition why you become to that expression. Is it very important for the thinking today? What's the difference between Buddhism and Christianity about the faith? It's just some reflection on this, no?
Let me see if I can help here a little bit. I think what is going on here, this will help. One of the things that is not talked about a lot, and I'm a professor of religious studies or philosophy of religion, but I study both philosophy and I study religion and I study world cultures. And I understand that the kind of what we call the religious background of many cultures in the Western Hemisphere, it's Christianity primarily, not all, but primarily. That is the dominant culture, which was missionary culture, which is why we talk about Euro-Christian culture. Not that it's the whole of Christianity, because Christianity is all over the world. It's growing very rapidly in countries that were colonized, but now, particularly in countries like Africa, it's been appropriated by the indigenous populations in their own way. And to a certain extent, a lesser extent, that's happening in Latin America. Latin America was the country that brought along the conquistadors Catholicism. And Catholicism was primarily Spanish Catholicism, which was, even in the European context, was a unique and rigid form. It was the kind of Catholicism that many people in Europe fought against in the 16th and 17th century. There's the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation. And Spain was, of course, the center of not only empire, but of religious empire. And historians have looked at this in many ways, say, well, there was also the struggle that went on for 600 years between the Moorish occupiers in Andalusia or in Iberia and the native Romanized Christian Visigoths who, in some ways there was always a crusade going on in Spain in some particular way, and how this influenced Spanish Catholicism in the 16th century and also motivated its conquest. At so in some ways, when you talk about the decolonial moment, you're talking about in some ways thinking beyond that kind of religious framework that is so much a part of what we call the episteme of the West, particularly in Latin America. North America, what's now the United States and Canada, the primary influence was English Protestantism, but we won't go there and so forth. And so in Buddhism, and again, I'm not a Buddhist scholar, but I've studied it. I understand the way in which Buddhism historically, particularly among the Dalit classes, played a kind of anti-imperial role in some ways. So I guess the question would be, when we're looking at decoloniality across the board, what is the role that different religious histories, legacies, ways of thinking practice? Because it's not a case that just all religion is the same. It's not. Religion, as we know, it's also been an ally of colonial influence throughout the centuries, but it's also been an ally in certain contexts of emancipation. In fact, we were talking about Indigenous Americans, Native Americans, who basically were not allowed to practice a religion for 50 years. And it was my own field of religious studies that, it's reliance on anthropology that began to challenge this, and had a lot to do with the kind of breakthrough that a lot of indigenous communities have in reclaiming their own past, their own traditions, and so forth. So I guess the question is, what role, if I could enlarge it, I don't know if that was Carlos's question, but what role do you see religion plays, say, in decoloniality from a Indian perspective, and realizing that the term Hinduism, which is often used by Americans to talk about India, is a colonial term. It simply means all the religions of India, which are complex and diverse and so forth. And then, of course, you now have the phenomenon of Indian nationalism, Hindu nationalism. So I guess that's what the question is, the role of religion.
Thank you, Carl. So yes, so I'm not, I have not read the Bible, but I'm also not a Buddhist scholar, but I cannot say how it is different, but I can only talk about Buddhism from the interpretations of it by various Buddhist scholars, that the idea of faith in Buddhism is about personal knowledge, because they say that Buddha, who was a person himself, like he meditated and sort of accumulated the knowledge about the world through his own experiences, through his own thoughts, through his own experiences. So in that case, Buddha says to his followers also that do not blindly believe anything that I say. Think about it, see it for yourself, and think about think about it in terms of your own moral compass that you have, without bias. And then if you think it is right for you, for the community around you, then believe in it. So that is sort of the idea of faith that the Buddha talks about, which is based on giving personal agency to the follower. Although I'm not sure how far in modern times or in contemporary times it is sort of believed in or manifested, but that was the sort of essence of his teachings that he began with, that to believe something, we should not blindly believe it. Before that, we should think about it on our own, through our own critical thinking, through our own experiences. So yes, so that is something I think which is relevant to this decoloniality that we are talking about, that we should not blindly believe or blindly just copy the West or imitate the West. in any terms, be it intellectual or political terms, and we need to look at our own context and see what is relevant for us, which may not be relevant for, say, the next country or the next continent. So we have to be ingrained in our own specificity. So that is a sort of thinking which I have interpreted from the Buddhist teachings. So yeah.
Okay, I think I have a question to answer to Chamat Pereira. So
Yes.
the question was that, like, did you get a chance to answer my question? I had to. Okay. The
Well, yeah,
question
would you
was,
like me to read that?
okay. So your comments of the philosophy of providence is interesting. Is it conversation within Indian Islam, or does it have a wider provision? Okay, so the philosophy of Rububiyya, or the philosophy of providence, is a is something that, like, some of the Indian, it's not Indian something. It is like kind of some Quranic verses is there, and if you know that, like, the liberation theologians, the way that, like, they used like interpreted Bible from a like marginal or oppressed perspective. So that is also that, like, a kind of like reading Quran from the perspective of the marginalized, or from the perspective of the oppressed people. So that is why that, like from different part of the world, some like theologians, Islamic scholars, so they like interpreted this Rububiyya for the people. So from India's this like there is a like Sufi tradition. So, and from there, that in modern time, Maulana Abul Kalam Azad and Maulana Bhashani, so, and other people, so they also that like followed that interpretation, and they also that like created some of the interpretation, interpretation of these terms from the vantage point of the oppressed people, and also that like from the vantage point, and that time the oppressed were the like the people who were who were the that like who were like who were oppressed by the colonial rules also. So that is the thing I want to add. And there is another thing that, like, okay, there is no South Asia. Yes, I agree, there is no South Asia, but institutionally, or that like something there is called South Asia, because we have like SARC, and even that like where I do study. So this is also the fruits of South Asia, like SARC countries. So I also agree that like there is no South Asia. That is why that like my point is that like this we have this like regional cooperative body, but at the same time that like we have all this enemy conception with our neighbors. So yes, the South Asia does not exist, but I referred as that like it exists in this like institutional like definition or something. And the third thing is that like Buddhist the blind wise man and the elephant is not about the unity of being. Yes, it's not unity of being, but I mentioned these things for that there is no like exact truth. There is always like partial truth. So in that like story that like six blind men, so we are also kind of blind men, because like if we like don't think about like our egocentricity or egoism, so we actually like don't know anything at all. So that means that like, so we can't claim the universal truth or something. So that is the moral that is why I interpreted this thing, that like as there is no universal things, so every partial truth is truth itself. Okay, so all these truths can make a universal truth, and this universal truth might not be universal for all. So that is why that like we all are like separated, but we have the unity of being, even that like not only the humans but also that like the non-humans also. So all these things of this world, all of this earth are somehow connected. So all these things creates a world. So that is the unity of being. All this like partial truths creates the truth of this universe. So that is what so is there any other question?
And actually, we are out of time for our session today. Thank you so much to our panelists. This was really fascinating. And stick around because we have another panel coming up right after this.